practical techniques for understanding tricky stakeholders. Now, I know because I've had the opportunity to speak to a number of you. We've had chats during the conference. I know that many of us are from different industries. We've got different job titles. But one thing that I think unites us as a community of analysts and change professionals is that we all have the opportunity to, I was going to say deal with, but to liaise with stakeholders. And it's probably fair to say that all of us at some point in our careers have dealt with tricky stakeholders. So raise your hand if you've ever dealt with a tricky stakeholder on a project. I think that's just about everyone. Keep your hand raised if you are dealing with a tricky stakeholder on your project right now. Okay, a few people lowered their hands there. That probably means the tricky stakeholder's in the room. So I'm not going to progress that line of questioning any further, but that's just about all of us. And what's interesting, right, is in the BA community, we quite rightly talk a lot about stakeholders. But rarely do we actually step back and reflect and talk about stakes. But a stakeholder is really only a stakeholder by virtue of the fact they have some interest, they have some stake in whatever it is we're doing. And it's often there's an element of perspectives that comes into this. Because much as I, as a business analyst, might think that, hey, this stakeholder's being really tricky. They're not liaising, they're not engaging in the way that I want. Well, guess what? That stakeholder might be looking at me thinking, that BA is really tricky. They're not speaking to me in my language, they didn't engage me at the right times, and now all of a sudden they want me to drop everything so I can work on their project. And I've got a day job to do. So maybe sometimes we need to think about the techniques that we use, as I'm sure we do, and deploy, engage in a whole different or additional ways. Now, I'm going to share with you today a whole series of tools, techniques around stakeholder analysis, stakeholder engagement, many of which I'm sure you will have seen before, in which case it will be a bit of a refresher. If you haven't seen them, it will be a whistle-stop tour. When you download the slides, there's a references slide at the very back. So if you want to read in more in depth on any of these techniques, the references slide is there for you. But I actually want to start with a bit of a story. And I'm going to kill the slides for this bit, actually. And it's going to come across as a bit of a curveball story, but like strap yourselves in because it is relevant, I promise. So I am what I like to describe as a bit of a reluctant driver. So I don't particularly enjoy driving. I didn't pass my test on my first or second attempt. It was a much, much higher number than that. We'll leave it there. I like to think that makes me a better driver. I like to think that. I live in a very dense city. I live in Portsmouth down on the south coast. I rarely drive, probably once every 2 weeks. And I also know nothing about the way an engine works, because it's not my thing. I don't know how cars work. I don't know how engines work. So I do what I suspect many of us do. Once a year, I take my car in for its MOT, and at the same time, I get it serviced. So this is my car here. You can tell by the number plate that it's mine. That's not really, that's Photoshop. In fact, it's paint. And about probably 6 months ago, I booked my car into a local branch of a national chain of garages. It's a brand you would recognise. And I went on the website, and it was a phenomenal experience because I go in, I put the reg number in, it knows that it's a Ford Fiesta 1.2 Z-Tech, great. It knows what kind of service it needs. I book in the time slot, I prepay for a discount, and I'm happy. It sends me an email with confirmation, which is great because I always like to have that to know that the transaction's happened. So I put it in my diary, and on that day, I drop my car off at the allotted time. And I drive up, and the first thing I notice is, you know, like garages, they have like the main garage bit, and then they have like a reception bit that's bolted onto the side, like a bit of an afterthought. Well, at that reception bit, there was a queue. And it was slow moving, and it was really unusual because this garage, one of the reasons I used them is they were always really effective and efficient. As I get closer to the front of the queue, I start to see that the mechanics, the people behind the reception, were really struggling. It looked a lot like someone had implemented a new IT system and they were resorting to using a paper diary. They were copying stuff off the IT to a paper diary. So I get to the front of the queue and I say, "Hi, I'm Adrian Reed. I've got the red Fiesta booked in for its MOT and service." And they're tapping away on the computer, far too many keystrokes than I thought they would have needed. And they say, I'm sorry, we can't find your reservation. They said, "Did you book online?" I said, "Yes." And they said, "There's a fault. Those reservations aren't feeding through properly. But don't worry, sir, we'll fit you in." Now, I don't know about you, but the words "will fit you in" doesn't fill me with confidence. But I go with it because I've always trusted them. They've always been okay in the past. Anyway, I go away from the garage. I get a call around about lunchtime, and they say, "You've got a slight radiator leak. We need to replace your water pump." Fair enough. I knew it had been leaking antifreeze. They could get it done by the end of the day. No problem. Then at the end of the day, I get a call that you never want to get from a garage. I later found out it was the regional manager calling me. And the first words he said to me were, "There has been a problem." Followed by, "We've made a mistake." Now, remember, I know nothing about engines. I know nothing about cars. And I'm not going to test you on this or anything, but raise your hand if you even vaguely know how an engine works, okay? Right, we've got quite a few people. Wow, awesome. So when I tell this next bit of the story to people who know about engines, what they tend to do is go... So you might find if there's someone near you that knows about engines, in a minute you get a bit of a moment. But remember, I didn't know what any of this meant. He said, "Adrian, when we were refitting the new water pump, we had to retension or change the timing belt." Yeah. You've got to the punchline early. Unfortunately, we didn't tension it right, so the timing belt slipped. There was a large bang. And your car is completely immobile. And they said, "We don't know the extent of the damage." To their eternal credit, he said, "But this is on us. This is our mistake. We will fix it. It will take time, but we'll get it resolved." Now, I think they probably assumed that I wanted the car back quickly, right? But my stake, remember, is I don't know about cars. I just want it back safely. Right? I don't care if it takes a few extra days. So anyway, he explains to me it's going to take a while. He's keeping me updated. 1 week goes by and he says, "Well, we've got a scope down there of the 16 valves in your car. We've broken 8 of them." Yeah. It then turns out that the motor factor company they used, they didn't have enough valves in the country. They had to ship in the particular valves. He was talking about opening the head gasket. I'm saying that like I know what it means. I don't. Apparently the block had to be sent off for pressure testing and whatever. So they were getting external experts to fix this car. 2 weeks turn into 3, 3 weeks turn into 4, and eventually they ring me and say, "Adrian, your car is ready." So I rock up to the garage, and the queue is still there. And they're still using the paper diary. They're still struggling with the IT system, but they give me the keys. They apologise, and I get back in the car. I turn the ignition, and it purrs like a new car. Largely, I gather, because it pretty much is. I drive away, and I have to do a major U-turn and go straight back to the garage, because the speedometer on my 1.2 2007 Fiesta looked like this. Now, the more perceptive amongst you in the audience will notice that my speedometer here is stuck at 140, that's 230 kilometres per hour, whilst the parking brake is on. Now, it's a 2007 1.2. I don't think it can do 140 miles an hour, especially not with the parking brake on. So I go back. I speak to the mechanic. The mechanic plugs into the diagnostics, and he says, "Well, it looks all right to me." I'm like, evidently not. He then says, "Actually, we've seen this before. There's a back door we can hack into to reset your speedo, but I don't know how to do it, but I've got a mate I can bring who I can get in tomorrow to do this for you." So fine, ask no questions. Tomorrow morning comes, good to their word, they fix it, right? But I'm a BA, I don't know what the root cause is, I don't understand. So I drive away, and I never trusted the car again. Because I didn't know how they broke it, I didn't know why the speedometer was wrong, they'd misjudged my state, I'd misjudged their state. Now, I was in the pub with my mate Gary a few weeks after this had happened, and Gary is one of those people who knows everything about cars. In fact, I should have rang Gary when this was happening. I think it's something about the name Gary. Every Gary I've ever met has been like a petrol head, right? So I was saying to him, I said, they did this, they broke the valves, the time belt slipped, and he did that thing, and he said, whoa, he said, Adrian, how old's your car? I said, it's a 2007 Ford Fiesta. He said, how much do you think it's worth? I said, well, you know what? I park it in a city on the road. It's got dents all over it. 800 quid if I'm lucky. He said, the work they've done on your car, Adrian, is probably somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 pounds for a car that is worth 800. Now, here's the thing. You think about that. You think, well, actually, if we'd had a different conversation, if they'd understood what I really wanted out of this transaction, I wanted safety, security, I didn't just want the car fixed, maybe we'd have created a different solution. If I'd had the audacity to say, how much is this costing? Maybe we could have had a conversation that went, give me £800, you save money, I save money, and everyone's a winner. But because we had that clash, we didn't understand each other, it didn't happen. The real irony was, about 3 months after they spent thousands of pounds at their own expense fixing my car, there was a catastrophic braking failure. Something to do with the ABS. I couldn't even bring myself to sell it because I couldn't live with the consequences if someone bought it and subsequently had an accident. So the only option I had was to scrap the car, for which I received the princely sum of £135. Which is not bad, right? But it's not the thousands that they spent on it. And I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, well, we don't work in a garage, Adrian, and we don't work on 2007 red Ford Fiestas. But I bet you've worked in situations where someone has imposed an IT solution on a bunch of people without understanding how it affects their work. Those people have then had to work around that with paper diaries like the mechanics were doing. And if you think about the different stakes in that situation, those poor mechanics were having to fit other people in because the online system wasn't working. That meant that they were busy, which meant they were making mistakes. And when you make mistakes, you then have to correct those mistakes, so you have even less time. So you've got this kind of doom loop occurring over and over again. But the good news, of course, is that as BAs, we can help avoid that. We can help avoid those kind of paper diary mechanic moments. And if we think about stakeholders, I'm sure that we think about our sponsor. Okay, so we've got sponsors, we've got internal stakeholders, and then I'm sure also we think about external stakeholders and we think about personas. Raise your hand if you've ever used personas as a technique. Yeah, fantastic. If you haven't, look it up. Great, archetypes of customer segments or stakeholder segments, user segments, whatever. And personas are great when they're based on data. Personas are great when they're based on some sort of insight. But I've worked with organizations, and I suspect you have too, where the personas are basically based on what someone in marketing reckons. And you kind of think, well, hang on a minute, we're building services, systems, processes based on what somebody in marketing reckons. The danger there is we start building for a normal that doesn't exist. And we end up kind of inadvertently marginalizing people. And we end up metaphorically saying to people, sorry, sir, or sorry, madam, you're an edge case. You don't fit our process. You go in exception flow 1, 2, 3. And nobody wants to feel like an edge case. So let me give you a persona. This is Bernard. It's not really Bernard. It's a bit of stock imagery, but go with me on this. And Bernard is 75. Now, rather tragically, when Bernard was in his late 60s, he was diagnosed with dementia. The particular flavour of dementia that Bernard was diagnosed with was mixed vascular and Alzheimer's, And unfortunately, he had a very, very steep trajectory. He deteriorated very, very quickly. By the time he was in his late 60s, early 70s, he couldn't remember passwords or PINs. What this meant was he couldn't access most financial products or services. Not only that, because he denied his diagnosis, as I suspect many of us would, the way he rationalised this was by thinking people are hacking his account. So when he rang his financial services providers, he appeared very paranoid. He appeared like a really awkward, angry customer. By the time he was in his early 70s, he was in specialist care and his family were dealing with his financial affairs through a lasting power of attorney. Now ask yourself this question, with all the personas and processes you've worked with as a BA. When was the last time you, we, all of us asked, how would this work for Bernard or Bernadette or any of the other marginalised voices that don't always get heard? You know, we hear a lot about, sort of lazy marketing stereotypes like millennials. Because, just because you're born between 1980 and 2000 means you've got something in common, apparently. But there are other real needs, characteristics that people have that affect the way they access services. And the great thing is, as BAs, we can ensure that these voices are heard. And I know that we've heard about ethics. Liz spoke about ethics, but it's important that we have that sort of ethical imperative to ensure those voices are heard. So I want to split the rest of my talk into 3 topics. I want to talk about stakeholders and stakes, so stakeholder analysis techniques. I then want to talk about perspectives, how different stakeholders can have different perspectives on the problem situation. And I then very, very briefly at the end want to talk about zooming out. And in that section, what I particularly want to talk about is what we actually mean by engagement and whether engagement is the only model that we can work with. So first of all, stakeholders and stakes. Well, when I say stakeholder analysis, I'm pretty sure that many, most, or possibly all of us are familiar with a grid that looks something like this. Okay, so raise your hand if you've ever seen a grid or used a grid that looks like, okay, yeah, fantastic. And this happens to be the version from the IIBA Business Analysis Body of Knowledge Guide, a fantastic reference guide if you haven't already seen it, but there are other versions, there's a BCS version as well. And if you haven't seen it, it's pretty simple. You plot a stakeholder based on their influence from 0 to 10, and the level of impact that a particular problem is having on them or a solution or intervention would have from 0 to 10. And it gives us approximate locations, communication strategies for them. The challenge can be, and you may have even found this if you've used this, that people don't neatly fit in one position. Because you might have, well, you know what? Kerry fits here. Oh, except for the non-functional requirements, where actually she's got less influence because there's an architectural sign-off, so she's here. When it comes to the website, she's over here. And for another part, she's here, and actually, all of a sudden, she's in multiple positions. And that's fine, it's useful, but you then add other stakeholders as well, and it gets very, very busy, and other stakeholders, and before long, it like starts to look like a fly swatter. Like we kind of swatted our awkward stakeholders on this grid. The other thing is that personal reflection. This bottom right-hand corner, keep informed. We're saying that the people who are most impacted by the problem or the likely intervention or solution, just because they don't have influence, we should just keep them informed. Now think about who sits there. That's users. That's customers. If you're in a governmental organisation, that's service, the actual thing the thing is built for. Now, I know in reality, none of us take that passive approach, right? We all kind of, we mould this to our own purposes, but there's more to it than this. So it's a good tool, and I'm not dissing it, it's a useful tool, but there are other techniques we can use as well as or instead of. One of the first ones I want to show you takes very similar dimensions to this, but just displays it differently, and in doing so, it creates such a different conversation. And that's the stakeholder rainbow. It's actually really, really intuitive. You take 2 dimensions, how influential someone is, so from most influential on the left to least, and you consider how affected they are, and that's like the bands, that would be the colours on our rainbow. So you've got most affected in the centre, moderately affected, least affected. Okay. And at the first glance, you might look at that and think, well, that's kind of the same. It's doing the same thing as the previous grid, and it is, but there's a key difference. And the key difference is it groups all of those people who are most affected, they cluster together in the middle. And that's really visual. It shows, look, these are the people that are really affected by what we're doing. Because so often what happens is we get change implemented here by someone who's not very influential, but they're very affected. And who's that change implemented by? Well, it's normally initiated by somebody up here who's very influential, but has no idea how the work actually works in the day-to-day job. And the thing is, the folks down here often have very, very different needs, aspirations, desires to the folks up here. These folks probably want return on investment, right? And that's an important aim. Don't get me wrong. But if we get, we won't get that if we don't service the needs of these folks in the centre as well. So it creates a different conversation. Incidentally, whenever I've used this technique, what's really curious is it started to create conversations about external stakeholders and things like customers of our customer. Like, do we need to know about them? Sometimes in a value chain, if the value chain's wide, you kind of do. So it just changes the conversation. What it doesn't do, though, so that kind of helps us with that bottom right-hand corner. But what it doesn't do is it doesn't help us with the fly swatter. So there's another technique I want to talk about briefly, which is known as the Stakeholder Interest Intensity Index. And with this, we take a particular stakeholder and we consider each area of the project or program. And we give them a score from 1 to 5 based on their interest and influence. So if someone was high interest, low influence, they'd be a 5/1. Right, if they were low interest, high influence, they'd be a 1/5. Okay. That might sound a bit abstract, so here's an example. You've got a sort of made-up example here, but you've got some areas here, so scanning and workflow, online portal. This is clearly once the solution's been agreed in this example. We've then got different stakeholders, and we've got different vested interest and influence scores. And I know what you're thinking. You're looking at that thinking, well, that's sort of kind of interesting, but it's even harder to read than the fly swatter. And I get that, and I agree with you, but there is a magic formula. If you're not mathematically minded, it looks a bit funky, but you can plug it into Excel, and it will do it for you automatically. It's the square root of v times I over 25, or rolls off the tongue. But what that does is it creates a single index from those two numbers, and it normalizes them. So the important thing for us as BAs is that if someone is high interest, even if they're low influence, they will still get a moderately high score. So they don't get forgotten about, they don't get lost. If you do that, you'll have a grid that looks something like this. Right? Again, it's kind of interesting, right? But it's not very actionable. But those of us who use Excel, when you've got ranges of numbers, you can start to do a bit of jiggery-pokery in Excel, and you can start to use conditional formatting. And when you've got conditional formatting, you're only a step away from having a heat map. And let's face it, everyone in a project loves a heat map. Because it's really visual, right? And now all of a sudden you've got, well, you know what, when it comes to scanning and workflow, customers, they're probably not going to have any direct opinions about that. They don't see it. Call center really care, even though they're low influence. When it comes to online invoices, well, finance are really, really key. So it's almost like when we're communicating, too much communication is almost as bad as not enough. If you over-communicate, people tune out. This helps us tailor who to communicate with when. So it's a more granular view on the traditional stakeholder approach. So we've talked about our stakeholders and states with our fly swatter, our rainbow, and our vested interest index. I want to talk now about perspectives on situations. And I should have warned you. Gosh, remiss of me. There is going to be a little bit of audience interaction in this session. That bit's coming up now. But I know by day 3 of a 3-day conference, that's not what you want to hear. So, to oil the wheels, I have a couple of prizes to give away. Okay, so I have a book and I have an electronic version, download voucher for the same book. Okay. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask a question, and it is going to desperately sound like a trick question, but it isn't. So there are no wrong answers to this question. I'm interested in your opinion. So I'm going to put the question on the screen, I'm going to shout it out, then I'm going to throw it over to you, and I just want you to, don't self-censor, maybe self-censor a bit. I want you to shout out the answer that first springs to mind, okay? And my question to you, and whoever's loudest or I can hear the first, we'll get a prize. So my question to you is, what is the Parking Enforcement Service for? If you're lucky enough to not know what the Parking Enforcement Service are, they're the lovely ladies and gents who put these little things on your windshield when you don't park where you should. So what is the Parking Enforcement Service? Over to you. What's it for? Who said revenue stream? So traffic flow, round of applause to this gentleman here. Would you like the electronic or the physical book? The physical book? Okay. So traffic flow, what else is it for? Revenue stream. Who said revenue stream? Okay, round of applause to that gentleman over there. Thank you very much. You get the electronic version of the same book. So traffic flow, revenue stream. Who's right? No, but yeah, revenue maybe. I don't know. It kind of depends on who you ask, right? It kind of depends on who you ask. And if you had those same, imagine you had different stakeholders with different perspectives on the same project. They're going to row. They're going to appear to agree, but they're not actually agreeing. They're only agreeing at a very superficial level. So there's a technique that you can use. Some of you may have come across the work of Peter Checkland before in soft systems methodology. If you haven't, there's a treasure trove of stuff awaiting you. But one particular technique which we can definitely take in our world as BAs is what's known as a root definition. This is one form. It's the PQR form of a root definition. The formal elaboration is do P by Q in order to contribute towards achieving R. We can bend that, perhaps, as BAs to be a system to do something by some means in order to contribute towards achieving some ends. Okay? So a system to do something by some means in order to contribute towards achieving some ends. Think about that in terms of the three questions we ask a lot as BAs. A system to do something. The what? By some means. The how? In order to contribute towards achieving some goals. The why. So it's really addressing that what, how, why. And we could apply that from a particular stakeholder's perspective. So it's kind of funny that you chose traffic flow and money and revenue, because the two examples I have prepared for you, and we hadn't met, you weren't stooges, is we might have one person, because the Parking Enforcement Service exists to generate revenue from motorists who break the law by diligently issuing tickets. This is in order to contribute towards an overall goal of balancing the city's books. Rah. A conflicting perspective might be, no, it's about keeping people safe by issuing fines and educating people. And that those stakeholders are going to clash. But knowing it, exposing it, letting it bubble up so we have the discussion. Here we've done this for a whole organisation. Of course, we could do that on a subsystem or a process or really any kind of level that we want. And if you think back to that vested interest index, right, you could add a perspective for the column, right? So we know when that particular stakeholder type needs to be engaged, and maybe we've got an idea of what their perspective is. We're starting to build up a knowledge base of who they are, how we engage with them, what their stake is. We could take it even further, and for each stakeholder group, however we define that for our project, ask, what does success look like for them? Or how would they measure success? And again, this is from Checkland. It's the 3 E's. So there's efficacy, which is how would they measure that the change, the system that we've, the process or whatever that we've implemented is working? How do we know it's better than it was before short term? Efficiency is how would they measure that it's doing that with the least amount of resources? And then there's effectiveness, which is, and how would they measure that it's achieving the long-term purpose or strategic goal that they think that process, system, whatever ought to have? Okay. And the thing is, I've found in my practice as a BA, quite often, people will agree on the first two, but they'll disagree on the third one. So think about the traffic example, the parking example. Well, efficacy. Maybe there's a measure of, the number of correctly issued parking tickets. Well, whether you believe that you're doing it for money or for safety, yeah, we agree with that measure. Efficiency, we do that with a minimum number of traffic cops, traffic wardens. Great, yeah, both agree with that. But when you get to effectiveness, the particular perspective that was about making money will be saying, well, actually, I just want to get the most money I can. I want people to park illegally, because that means I get more money, like taken to an extreme. The other perspective will be saying, no, actually, if we collect no money, then we've done the best job we possibly can, because that means nobody's parking illegally. So you can get that situation where people agree superficially on the top two, because nobody's delved down, nobody's had the audacity to ask below the surface what they're actually wanting and needing. So creating these conversations, and these are just really thinking tools, to create conversations, to create different conversations. And you can add these, if you think about, you've got your vested interest index, we've got a perspective, we've got our 3 E's. We're starting to get the beginnings of a mini persona or some sort of, prototype persona for a segment. Now, what's even more interesting is I'm sure many of you are looking at that and thinking, well, yeah, but customers, it's a bit broad. And you're right. But that creates the conversations about, well, if that grouping is too broad, let's slice it, let's divide it. Let's see what segments we should have there. Let's not just take millennials and Gen X. Let's figure out what's meaningful. Let's make sure the marginalised voices are heard as well. So it's a useful technique that scales across that sort of approach. The challenge, of course, comes because when people don't agree on what the problem is. And you can get those situations where people don't agree and they're both right. So here, we've got a stakeholder on the left saying there is pink yarn in that mess. And you've got a stakeholder there saying there is red yarn in that mess. And they think they disagree. But they're both right. They're just both partially right. And I think in a lot of the complex, messy projects we work in, no one individual has enough knowledge. But between us, we might have enough to learn our way through to experiment if we bring those perspectives together. So I want to talk about a technique very briefly, known as cognitive mapping. I've only got the time to touch on it today, so if you want to know more, do chat to me after, because I could talk for a long time about this one, or days. And with cognitive mapping, I'll show you an abstract example to start with. So if you imagine at the top, you had some form of negative outcome, right? So I'm just using letters here, but that could be a negative outcome like profits are dropping or customers are leaving. The first thing you do is you map it from a particular stakeholder's perspective, and those 3 dots represent the formal term is these are bipolar constructs. So what that means is if they say that dropping profits is the thing they're trying to avoid, you say, okay, so dropping profits is the problem. What do you want to have happen instead? Now that sounds really obvious, doesn't it? Well, obviously they want increased profits, Adrian. But do they? Sometimes they might be happy with sustained profits. Actually, you might have one stakeholder who thinks, we just want to manage the decline. It's a product that's failing and that's okay. So it encourages us to ask not just what the problem is, but what do you want to have happen instead? So the 2 dots there read as like X is happening instead of Y, and we want Y. Okay. And then you track back all the causes and the sub-causes, and we can use all of our good techniques like 5 Whys and Why else to do that, and it's a visual depiction. So here is a partial worked example. They're much, much bigger than this in reality, but you can see here we've got the problem at the head is a decrease in customer retention rather than maintaining a stable level. So we're aiming for a stable level. Great. Why does that happen? Because we've got a decrease in customer satisfaction rather than maintaining a stable level. Okay. Why is that happening? Because we've got a problem with orders being regularly delivered late instead of on time. Okay. Why is that happening? Because we're using cut price delivery firms instead of full service firms. Okay. Why else is that happening? Because we've got problems with IT and information and all the rest of it. And you can go on down to root causes and so on. And you can start to then get a perspective from each stakeholder about why do they think this problem is happening. The really cool thing, I think, is, and by the way, this technique comes from a technique known as strategic options decision and analysis, or SODA. There's lots more associated with this. But you can then take these individual perspectives, because we've got those different stakeholders, we've got their PQR, their root definition, we've got their 3 E's, we now understand why they think the problem's a problem. We can create a conversation around it, merge those different maps together into a shared map. And there will be differences, there will be disagreements. But at that point, we're then having a conversation about the map, rather than kind of saying, well, you know, the underwriters are wrong and claims are right. We're saying the arrow is in the wrong place here. And that's a much more productive discussion to have. You can then start to draw boundaries around bits of the map and say, well, it appears there's a problem with the courier firm. Shall we just try using a different one? And if it works, let's keep doing it. Let's amplify it. If it doesn't work, stop it. So it works very well with a lot of the approaches in the business agility space about experimenting, about having, safe-to-fail probes, as Dave Snowden of Cynefin refers to it, and so on. So a very, very useful set of approaches. So we've talked about stakeholders and stakes with our traditional 4-box model, extending that to our rainbow, and then our vested interest index. We've talked about perspectives with our root definitions, our PQR, our 3 E's, our cognitive maps, our group maps. I want to briefly talk about zooming out in closing. And this next question is a trick question, and unfortunately I don't have a prize for it, but please still shout out an answer. And my question to you is, what is this? What is this? It is a planning notice. What else is it? A waste of time. A round of applause for this gentleman here. Yes, so yeah, I'm being cynical. So this, ladies and gentlemen, is what Portsmouth City Council call consultation. Okay. Now, I'm being slightly unfair. It is technically a statutory form of consultation that must be done. Okay, that's not the only way they consult. But you think about it as a form of consultation. How accessible is it? If you don't leave your home, you might not see it. If you do leave your home, you might not be able to read it. And yes, it's on the website, but often the people who aren't leaving their home might also not be internet connected. So there are issues around that type of thing. And it's sort of interesting because this got me thinking, well, what do we mean by consultation? How does that differ from engagement? Because we talk about stakeholder engagement a lot in our world. And are they different? And I think they are. And if you think about a scale, well, at one end, there is a sort of passive approach to stakeholder direction. And I can still remember when I was a junior manager, one of my first jobs, a very senior manager was very clear. He said, Adrian, your job is to tell and sell. Right? You're not to have an opinion on these changes. You're not to elicit opinions of your staff. You tell them and you sell them that it's a good thing. And that can be an appropriate approach. It's like if a fire marshal came in here now and said, there's a fire, that door's blocked, go out this one, that's not a time to have a focus group. And there might be times in very chaotic environments where that's what we need to do. Consultation implies that we're going to solicit information, but there's going to be a decision maker making a decision. That's okay as long as we're transparent about it. What isn't okay is where we call consultation engagement. We pretend there's more engagement, but it's really consultation. Engagement, at least to me, implies a two-way flow. They're a bit more involved. Further up the spectrum, we could have actually interactive participation. People become part of the project. They're part of the co-creation. At the other end of the spectrum, there's also, and I've not seen this one personally in a work commercial environment, but I believe there are examples out there, but self-mobilization. Real self-organizing teams. The closest I can think of that I've seen is the Extinction Rebellion movement, which actually have a very clear set of principles and are able to mobilize a whole bunch of people on a voluntary basis. But think about being at the beginning of a project. You could imagine it, we could imagine it as like a slider. Because there's no right or wrong position, it just depends on the context, but we can create the conversation. How are we going to engage? Because it also implies something about power, because at this end, at the passive end, we're saying we've got power over the people. And if we're going to have that passive approach, if there's a need to, we'd better make sure we actually have got power. If we're at the other end, then we're actually delegating power to people. And that is an approach that I'm far more comfortable with, as it happens. But we need to make sure that the middle managers are, and the senior managers, and the other folks in the organisation. Otherwise, it won't work terribly well. So we've talked about stakeholders and stakes. We've talked about our traditional grid, our rainbow, our vested interest index. We've talked about perspectives with PQR, our 3 E's, building up that rich knowledge base of our stakeholders. And we've talked about zooming out with our slider. Before I finished, I wanted to start where we began, because I thought, we've talked about all these techniques, but I started with that crazy story about my car. And I thought you might be wondering, what car did you buy next? And it's interesting, isn't it, right? Because as business analysts, quite often, when we see a change internally, we're like, well, no, you mustn't jump to the solution. You must do a business case, or at least some form of thinking. And I decided to sort of apply that inwardly. And I looked at my car's logbook, and in the last 12 months, I'd done less than 2,000 miles. I drive on average once every 2 weeks. I live an 8-minute walk away from a train station. People sometimes tell me, that's really specific, Adrian, why not just say 10 minutes? Trust me, if you live 8 minutes away from a train station, it's important you know it is exactly 8 minutes if you're going to catch the train. So I didn't, is the answer. I didn't buy a car. Or rather, this is now one of my cars. Because it turns out there's a scheme, I wasn't aware it existed, called Enterprise Car Club. There are 2 cars parked within a 10-minute walk of where I live. You join a club, you pay an annual, a monthly membership fee, and you pay by the hour. You swipe a membership card, it opens the doors, you get the key fob. And I now get to drive a 2019 Fiesta or a 2018 Astra. The only slight problem with this is I haven't driven a car since my 2007 car. They've changed a lot since then. I couldn't even start the car to start with, but that's a whole nother story. The really final ponder point I wanted to leave you all with is, I also talked about the Bernards and the Bernadettes of our world. The people who aren't necessarily able to or choose not to have a voice. And my question to you is, in your project, my project, who's missing? Who's the stakeholder who isn't being heard? And what impact is it having? And more importantly, what can we do as a community, a global community of enthusiastic, empowered, passionate change professionals to ensure that diversity, that inclusion is built in from the very beginning, and that we ensure those marginalised voices remain heard. And with that, I will say thank you very much.